Welcome back to Zoospiracy. This is Rebecca, and I just want to start off by saying thank you so much to everyone who checked out the very first episode. I had 29 streams on Spotify, and that makes me really happy because if I had 29 people in the room right now supporting me, that is a room full of people, okay? And that's a big deal. So I appreciate you for checking me out and the podcast, and I hope you stick around because I really want to try to make it just better and better as we go. I got a new mic. If you're on Patreon, you can see the video versions of these podcasts and me holding this mic right now. Hopefully it sounds a little bit better because the first episode was recorded on a very small microphone, but I think it got the job done. So we'll see as it goes. And I'm really trying to up my game with the technology to make the sound as clear and as best as possible for you guys. If you're new here, this is where true crime meets the animal world. We focus on the animals. We stay grounded in the documented facts, and we talk about the stories that often get minimized, misunderstood, or quietly forgotten. I'm actually recording today on Valentine's Day, so I hope you guys had a wonderful day full of love, chocolate, good food, and lots of pictures. If you have a really beautiful girl, you better be taking her picture as much as possible because we're only going to be young for so long, and girls love to get dolled up, taken out somewhere special. And if you whip that phone out, I'm telling you, she is going to love it. Make sure you get those good angles because the only way you could really ruin it is if you take awful pictures. And I feel like maybe some guys do that on purpose. Like you're trying to sabotage her and never make any of her pictures look good. But I digress. Valentine's Day is marketed as love. Flowers, jewelry, romantic dinners, maybe a proposal. It's a holiday built around attachment and devotion. But across the United States, in police reports and court records, another pattern is quietly surfacing around romantic relationships. When love collapses into resentment, control, retaliation, sometimes the target isn't the former partner. Sometimes it's an animal. Viewer discretion is advised. This episode contains discussion of animal harm. All information presented is based on publicly available court documents, statutes, and reporting from established news outlets. When discussing ongoing or recent cases, language such as alleged, according to investigators, or prosecutors stated, reflects the legal status at the time of reporting. Any individuals mentioned are presumed innocent unless and until convicted in a court of law. This episode is not about speculation. It's about documented patterns, charges, sentencing, and the growing recognition that harming an animal during a breakup is not random. It's often deliberate. In 2025, authorities in Hillsborough County, Florida, arrested a former law enforcement officer in connection with an alleged poisoning of his ex-girlfriend's dog. According to reporting from Fox 13, Tampa Bay, and People magazine, investigators determined that the dog, a Maltese named Milo, died from antifreeze poisoning. Antifreeze contains ethylene glycol, a chemical widely documented in veterinary toxicology literature as causing severe kidney failure, neurological symptoms, and prolonged suffering if untreated. Hillsborough County sheriffs described the act publicly as a cruel and deliberate act. According to investigators, the poisoning allegedly occurred after the romantic relationship ended. The suspect was charged with felony animal cruelty under Florida law, and the case proceeded through the legal system. Let's pause on that because in Florida, it's a felony. In Florida, aggravated animal cruelty is classified as a third-degree felony punishable by up to 5 years in prison and a fine. 5 years is the statutory maximum. Sentencing outcomes can vary depending on plea agreements, criminal history, and judicial discretion. The legal system recognizes intentional cruelty as serious enough to elevate beyond the misdemeanor status, and yet, compared to other violent crimes, the sentencing range often feels limited when the harm involved is deliberate, such as poisoning. Milo did not understand the emotional collapse of this relationship. Milo experienced toxic ingestion. He experienced organ failure, and that's not a rhetoric, it's a veterinary fact. Poisoning is one of the slowest and most painful ways to die for any living creature. It's just absolutely cruel beyond anything you can really wrap your head around, especially a little Maltese. If you guys don't know what these dogs are, they're little white fluffy dogs When we talk about revenge-motivated animal cruelty, we have to zoom out beyond individual headlines and look at behavioral escalation patterns documented in criminology. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit has repeatedly stated that animal cruelty is one of several behaviors that may appear in the developmental histories of certain violent offenders. This is not a blanketed accusation. It does not mean that everyone who harms an animal will go on to harm a person, but it's much more likely. Longitudinal research examining incarcerated violent offenders has shown disproportionately higher rates of prior animal abuse compared to the general population. In practical terms, what that means is that animal cruelty is sometimes an early rehearsal for power and control. In the context of romantic relationships, control is often the central psychological theme. Domestic violence experts describe coercive control as a pattern of behaviors designed to isolate, intimidate, and dominate a partner. Those behaviors can include financial restrictions, social isolation, surveillance, threats, and in documented cases, threats toward pets. Several court transcripts across the United States include statements from victims who reported hearing variations of the same sentence. If you leave me, I'll kill your dog. That is not a hypothetical threat either. It appears in protective order filings, it appears in affidavits supporting felony charges, and it appears in sentencing memoranda. And when the threat becomes action, the action is not random. Poisoning requires planning. Shooting a dog during a custody exchange requires some timing. Blunt force trauma requires proximity and thought. These are not accidents. They are deliberate and intentional acts. Let's examine the sentencing in these cases a bit closer. In many states, first-time aggravated animal cruelty offenders may be eligible for probation, mandatory counseling, community service, and restitution. In some jurisdictions, incarceration may be limited unless the cruelty is classified as torture or involves multiple animals. I mean, why? Why does it have to hit all of these certain parameters to be justified in sentencing to match the crime? I mean, I think it just makes sense to match the crime to the sentence. Meanwhile, federal law under the PACT Act provides for up to 7 years in prison for certain extreme acts of cruelty when they fall under federal jurisdiction. However, most domestic revenge cases are prosecuted at the state level and not federally. So while the law has evolved symbolically, enforcement still varies dramatically depending on jurisdiction, the prosecution's discretion, and plea negotiations. There is also a structural issue at play. Animals are still legally defined as property in most U.S. states. That classification influences how harm is conceptualized in court. Property damage statutes and restitution calculations often hinge on a market value. A purebred dog may be valued in dollars. Veterinary bills may be reimbursed, but emotional devastation does not factor cleanly into these statutory frameworks. Some courts have begun allowing victim impact statements that address the emotional trauma from pet loss, but statutory penalties remain largely financial or capped by felony class. To understand why this matters, consider the psychological reality of antifreeze poisoning, one of the most commonly documented revenge methods in these types of cases. Veterinary toxicology references describe 3 stages of ethylene glycol poisoning. The first stage may include vomiting, lethargy, and neurological impairment. The second stage may appear deceptively stable before internal damage accelerates. The third stage involves acute kidney failure, severe dehydration, and often death without aggressive treatment. This is not a quick passing. It is a progressive and brutal systematic shutdown. When the sheriff department described the Florida poisoning as a cruel and deliberate act, that language reflected both intent and suffering. And cruelty as a behavioral concept matters. Psychologists define cruelty not simply as causing harm, but as causing harm with an awareness of suffering. That distinction separates negligence from intentional infliction. When an animal is harmed during a breakup, courts often examine the evidence of intent. Text messages, surveillance footage, internet searches, purchase records, and timing. In several documented cases nationwide, investigators have presented digital evidence showing searches such as, quote, "How long does antifreeze take to kill a dog?" Or, Quote, will a necropsy show poison? Those search histories have been cited in probable cause affidavits supporting felony charges. Digital forensics has made it harder for such crimes to remain ambiguous. And yet, even with the evidence of planning, sentencing often remains limited. So why? Part of the answer lies in judicial prioritization. Courts handle violent crimes against humans, weapons charges, narcotics trafficking, sexual offenses, fraud cases, and more. Within that hierarchy, animal cruelty, even felony animal cruelty, may not receive the same prosecution intensity. I think that's so sad because these cases are some of the most brutal and cruel, and I understand that resources are often limited, but they never come to the front, almost ever. And criminologists caution against minimizing these cases. Research examining incarcerated offenders has found that individuals convicted of severe violent crimes report childhood or adolescent animal abuse at higher rates than nonviolent offenders. Again, correlation does not equal causation, but patterns matter in risk assessments. This is why many domestic violence shelters now partner with animal welfare organizations. Historically, victims delayed leaving abusive relationships out of fear that their pets would be harmed. Surveys conducted by advocacy organizations have found that a significant percentage of domestic violence survivors reported staying longer in dangerous situations because they could not secure a safe placement for their animals. The pets become both leverage and a barrier. That is the broader social consequence of revenge-motivated cruelty. Now let's get back to Valentine's Day. Holidays heighten emotional expectation, romantic narratives amplify pressure, and social comparison increases. Proposals, public displays of affection, and symbolic gestures dominate the media. For couples already experiencing strain, those expectations can intensify conflict. Law enforcement agencies have reported increases in domestic disturbance calls during major romantic holidays. While not every argument escalates to violence, emotional volatility can peak during symbolic dates. When a breakup occurs near Valentine's Day, resentment can feel amplified by cultural messaging about love and loyalty. And in documented cases, the animal becomes the final assertion of control. If you leave, you'll lose everything. But the animal is not an object in a negotiation. It's a sentient being. And sentience is not a philosophical argument. It's a biological fact. Mammalian pain pathways, stress hormone release, and behavioral distress responses are extensively documented in veterinary medicine. When cruelty is minimized as a pet dispute, we erase the biological reality of suffering. It's also worth noting that certain states have begun enhancing penalties. Some jurisdictions now mandate psychological evaluation and counseling for convicted animal cruelty offenders. Others require forfeiture of animal ownership rights. I mean, come on. If you get convicted in any sort which way, you should not be able to own any animals, period. For example, Florida's registry initiative reflects recognition that individuals convicted of cruelty may pose future risk to animals. That registry exists because prevention requires transparency. Still, even with the registries and felony statutes, the question remains, do penalties reflect the severity of this intentional suffering? For comparison, burglary of an unoccupied structure in some states may carry penalties equal to or greater than aggravated animal cruelty. That disparity raises uncomfortable ethical questions about legal valuation. This episode is not about political alignment. It's about documenting the legal frameworks. The PACT Act represented a bipartisan acknowledgement that extreme cruelty warrants federal attention. Florida's registry reflects local acknowledgments that cruelty patterns matter. FBI data collection reflects institutional acknowledgement that tracking is necessary. Progress has occurred, but animals continue to appear in court records as collateral damage in human relationships. And the phrase that echoes across many case files is consistent. If I can't hurt you, I'll hurt what you love. It's not poetic, it's documented. So on a day dedicated to love, perhaps the deeper question is this: how do we protect the most vulnerable participants in our emotional lives? Because animals cannot interpret betrayal. They cannot contextualize resentment. They only experience what is done to them. And when that experience is weaponized, justice must move beyond symbolism. It must reflect the reality of harm. Unfortunately, this case is not isolated. Research into domestic violence and animal abuse has repeatedly identified what criminologists call the link. Multiple peer-reviewed studies, including research published in journals such as Violence Against Women and the Journal of Interpersonal Violence, have found that a significant percentage of domestic violence survivors report that an abuser threatened, harmed, or killed a pet. Estimates vary, but many studies place that number between roughly 1/4 to more than 2/3 of survivors surveyed. That range is wide, but even the lower boundary is staggering. Threatening a pet is rarely impulsive. It is frequently strategic. A pet represents emotional attachment. A pet represents loyalty. A pet represents something the partner cares about deeply. When control over a partner diminishes, harming the pet can become a means of exerting power. In 2016, the FBI began tracking animal cruelty as its own category in the National Incident-Based Reporting System, known as the NIBRS. Prior to that change, animal cruelty was grouped under miscellaneous offenses. Once separated, thousands of incidents were recorded annually. Oh, that is so sad. That is heartbreaking. This does not necessarily mean that cruelty increased in 2016. It just means that the data became visible in the federal system. The FBI has publicly acknowledged that intentional animal cruelty is sometimes present in the backgrounds of individuals later convicted of violent crimes against humans. No, not every single person charged with animal cruelty will escalate to interpersonal violence, and correlation is not inevitability, but the documented overlap has been strong enough for behavioral analysts to treat animal cruelty as a potential warning indicator in certain contexts. Psychopathy itself is a clinical diagnosis assessed using structured tools such as the Hare Psychopathy Checklist. It is not appropriate to label an individual as a psychopath without formal evaluation and documented findings. However, research in forensic psychology has identified that individuals who engage in deliberate, repeated acts of animal cruelty sometimes display traits associated with antisocial personality patterns, including lack of empathy and willingness to inflict suffering to achieve control. When a pet is targeted after a breakup, the act often communicates a message. If I can't hurt you directly, I will hurt what you love. The psychological framing appears repeatedly in court testimony across states. In 2019, then-President Trump signed the Preventing Animal Cruelty and Torture Act, commonly known as the PACT Act. This federal law made certain acts of extreme cruelty a federal felony when they occur within federal jurisdiction or affect interstate commerce. The statute criminalizes intentional acts such as crushing, burning, drowning, suffocating, impaling, or otherwise subjecting an animal to serious bodily injury. Violations can carry penalties of up to 7 years in prison. Personally, that's not enough. It should be 70. But I guess it's something. It's important to clarify, though, that most animal cruelty cases are prosecuted at the state level. The PACT Act does not replace those state statutes, but its passage does signal federal recognition that extreme cruelty warrants felony-level attention nationwide. Florida has also implemented measures reflecting increased seriousness around animal cruelty. In Hillsborough County, for example, authorities maintain an animal abuser registry listing individuals convicted of certain animal abuse offenses. The registry allows public awareness and can be accessed by shelters and organizations screening potential adopters. The purpose is prevention and accountability. It acknowledges that some individuals convicted of cruelty may reoffend. Sentencing disparities remain a significant issue for animals. In many states, aggravated animal cruelty carries maximum penalties ranging from 2 to 10 years. However, plea agreements, probation, and reduced sentences are common outcomes in first-time felony cases. Meanwhile, though, harming a law enforcement canine often carries enhanced penalties comparable to assaulting an officer. Legally, the system distinguishes between categories of animals: but biologically, pain is pain, and suffering is suffering. Valentine's Day amplifies emotional volatility. Again, law enforcement agencies frequently report that increased domestic disturbance calls happen around romantic holidays. When resentment and perceived betrayals escalate, the risk of retaliatory behavior increases. And in documented cases, it's obvious that animals have become leveraged during these escalations. Across multiple states, news archives reveal similar patterns. In California, prosecutors charged an individual with felony animal cruelty after alleging a dog was poisoned following a relationship dispute. In the Midwest, court records show instances where dogs were shot during custody exchanges. In rural property disputes, livestock have been intentionally killed during separations. Each case varies factually, but the pattern remains consistent. The animal becomes a symbolic target. Legally, animals are still classified as property in most jurisdictions. That classification influences both charging and restitution. A purebred dog may be assigned monetary value in court proceedings. Emotional attachment may be acknowledged in victim impact statements, but the underlying legal framework often remains property-based. But the emotional impact is not property-based. Owners frequently describe the death of a pet as equivalent to losing a family member. In the Florida case, public reporting quoted the owner describing the shock of receiving the call that her dog had died. The emotional devastation is part of the harm, but it does not change the statutory ranges. When examining revenge animal cruelty, it is crucial to remain precise. Not every breakup leads to violence. Not every individual charged with cruelty has a broader pattern of violence, but documented cases show that when an animal is deliberately harmed during a relationship breakdown, the act often serves as a communicative function. It's a method of asserting dominance, retaliation, or punishment. The legal system has made progress. Federal felony recognition exists, and many states have upgraded cruelty statutes. Registries exist in some counties. Law enforcement training increasingly incorporates the link between animal abuse and domestic violence. And yet, punishments often remain limited relative to the suffering inflicted. Poisoning is one of the worst ways to die. It's not instantaneous. Blunt force trauma is not painless. Starving is not abstract. And veterinary literature documents the physiological realities in clinical detail. On Valentine's Day, messaging revolves around devotion and protection. But when devotion curdles into resentment, animals can become collateral damage. They cannot anticipate this escalation. They cannot testify or file restraining orders. The rise in documented cases does not necessarily mean society is becoming more cruel. It may mean that we're better at recording that cruelty. But recording alone is not prevention. If you are leaving a relationship and fear retaliation, many domestic violence organizations now incorporate pet safety planning into their services. Some shelters partner with foster networks to house animals temporarily. Recognizing the risk to pets is part of modern safety planning. If you suspect animal cruelty, report it to local law enforcement or animal control. In many jurisdictions, cruelty reports can be made anonymously. Documented intervention can prevent escalation. This episode is not about sensationalizing breakups. It's about acknowledging that animals are sometimes used as instruments in human conflict. It's about recognizing that cruelty towards an animal is not trivial. It's about understanding that legal classification does not diminish biological suffering. Valentine's Day celebrates love, but justice must extend to the most defenseless participants in human relationships. Animals do not consent to our emotional volatility. They depend on us for safety. And when that safety is weaponized, the harm reverberates far beyond a single household. And that's the case for today. You can follow Zoospiracy on Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, X, and Patreon. If you have information about an animal cruelty case, you can reach out to share your story at zoospiracy@gmail.com. Because sometimes the most dangerous threats are the ones made in private, and sometimes the only voice an animal has is the one willing to speak.